So, Healthcare Workers for Palestine came about in October. We're a collective of healthcare workers from all different sides of the profession, doctors, nurses, that too, mental health professionals, and students as well, and from across the U.S. It started from a petition that had a couple of thousand signees, I'd say over 4,000, and then from that sort of those core tenets and pillars, we were able to really formulate a group that has just continued to grow day by day. The New York City's chapter is the largest of all the chapters. The WhatsApp group is large and unruly, but we welcome the numbers. And yeah, I think from my perspective, being in healthcare for a while, it's not something I ever really expected to exist within these spaces in the U.S. Having seen, what my father had been going through in the 80s and 90s when he was doing his work, activism work and organizing work in Chicago, how difficult it was, how the difficulties continued to surmount, doing SJP, going through school. Never did I ever think that there would be an organized group of healthcare workers that are committed to liberation for Palestine, but also, no, it's true, but also liberation of all folks that have lived under the shadow of imperialism. So again, thank you all for being here, and we welcome you to join the struggle and to join our organization in whatever capacity you see fit if you haven't already.
So we wanted to open up by asking Lara and Stephen, how did this book come to be, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, for which both of them are co-authors? And what work did you do both on the ground in Palestine as clinicians and through your research to bring this text to life?
I guess I'm going to start off with that one, as is per Lara's and I's practice with this kind of question usually. How did it come to be? Well, in 1948, so that's the start of it. I think the more personal one is that about 10 years ago, Lara and I were I was thinking about this actually earlier, and we really haven't contextualized in this because we just kind of fell into a conversation about dialogue initiatives within psychoanalysis, because what was pulled, this is like the day, like, oh, let's just talk it out, and like you have like soft Zionists who are like, yeah, this is bad, but we can, and everyone's like flashing their good Palestinian friend and all that sort of stuff, and like, so we like actually engaged and sort of took time to engage the sort of thinker who is always being thrown around, and whose work we had a lot of trouble with, but we were being incredibly respectful to her and her work. And so we wrote this piece, but it demands to be read with nuance and care and a bit of a critical eye, because otherwise it sounds like, I think people have come to us since that time, say, oh, you kind of endorse this sort of idea of like the third and all this sort of nonsense, which we actually were critiquing. So it was that point that I think we just sort of were brought into this collaborative moment, and thought we needed to be a bit more proactive, let's say, and forthright. And also, I think there are so many people within psychoanalysis which are generally like horrible people and coercive people, and didn't deserve the generosity and care and tact and diplomacy and respect that we were giving them. And so that opens up, so that's how it came to be. Literally, me laying on the floor, Lara on the couch, and us talking and start writing. The usual. What did you do, what work did you both do on the ground? So initially, I was fortunate enough to get a grant to go live in Palestine for about 6 months and kind of doing the field work. But before we did that, we did this sort of, again, I'm like a good scholar. Right? I'm all about scholar. Like this is the first archival book that I ever wrote. So I was like, okay, you read all the material, you read everything, you really work, like find out who's done work before, who's on the ground. We got all the lists, we took all the questions, and we show, So we put this sort of like a big, file of 1,000 different questions. Me imagining that I'm going to say, like, well, Muhammad, who do you really ascribe to? Is it Lacanian thinking, or that sort of thing? Like, what school? And so I kind of get there and we realize that all those questions are absolutely irrelevant. This is not to say that Palestine is not like every other country where psychoanalytic practitioners have their allegiances, are sectarian, are committed to those sectarian practices and theories. But it's also to realize that sort of in real time, there was something else to learn, right? That this wasn't necessarily about some oneristic sort of fascination with how Palestinians enliven psychoanalytic theory in ways that Westerners don't, right? And I think it's through our initial conversations, and then Lara and I started to go back regularly over a number of years, having conversations with Palestinians. And what's really fascinating is the way we met our clinician friends. It was, again, we had done preliminary research, we met certain people. Some people we met were like, and some people we were like, you felt their energy. And the way we met other people was always by word of mouth. And it literally sort of started to sort of give life to this social network, this network of social relations that exists among clinicians in Palestine. Everyone opening a door for us, the next door, and every time you go in the next door, we were welcomed very generously. And every time, and then you realize every room doesn't have one only door, it has a number of different doors. And there's this sort of literally network that started to emerge at the same time as us listening to these clinicians and thinking about how they have to sort of practice their own therapy in social conditions that are fixtures. So it really was, again, like for me, and Lara can answer on her own sort of perspective, but for me as a scholar who has always been like really goofily textual and historical and archival, to see things emerge in this sort of like very real, embodied space, living in an actual colonial situation was the guide through which we could write this book, if that makes sense. It gave us the methodology.
So Stephen is a Marxist and very big on autocritique. So this is part of what you're hearing also, and I'm going to fill it in a little more and be a little bit more fair to you as well in it. But I do want to go back to this journal that we had done that original article in, because there's these ways in which you go back and you're just like, oh, I wish I hadn't written that, right? You go back and you're like, but it's important for us in movements to look and say, again, these moments aren't failures, they're moments of where you're trying to work through something. And the most important thing is you recognize, oh, here are the limitations of that, and I did hit up against the wall, and to be very honest about why those walls were. So I'm going to see a little piece that I don't think we've said really publicly, which is, it's fine. Part of the thing is that you end up feeling when you're engaging these sorts of things, and I love that you brought in immediately how you can't imagine that this is happening now, right? I think part of the reason why this movement is happening now is that many of us are just unwilling to compromise anymore, right? We've done so, for it to get to this point where we have a movement of healthcare workers for Palestine, it's because we've tried every single compromise under the sun, and all of that also ends up demanding that we give up something, and that giving up something often means, our commitments, our political commitments, our ethical commitments, to become more palatable to the hypothetical person that we're thinking is going to come in. And I think we're at the place now where just like that's no longer what we're willing to do. And these are what we call in the book psychic refusals, right? And it's people on the ground in Palestine that have really taught us what it means to engage in a psychic refusal. So the article that we wrote was a series of what looks like inconsequential compromises, but we were feeling them affectively, right? So for example, the editor coming back and being like, hey, can you change the name of this person, this pseudonym that you chose for this person? Because it might be confused with the person that we're trying to dedicate this issue to. And as though there aren't two people in the world named Iyad, right? I'm going to confuse, which you start to see if you're reading psychoanalytically, the racism in even that ask. And the inability of that editor to sort of be like, oh, this person we're dedicating it to is named Iyad Sarraj, and who's a figure in Palestine, so it's important for me to speak his name, right? And then our pseudonym being Iyad, as though they're going to be the same person. And so immediately you're just like, this collapse is on you, dude, not on us. But sort of having to be, again, pulled into like good scholarship and being like, okay, I'm going to compromise here. And then we end up with this piece, which, much of it is important. Like Stephen said, there are nuances to it that I think we can stand behind. And then there are pieces that we look back and say, this is exactly a point in time where we can look and say, here are the compromises we made and where did that get us? Actually, nowhere. It actually fills up a space that you look back and you're like, I wish we hadn't done that. And so this is what I want to bring it back to our book, is that our book fundamentally from the beginning was very much Fanonian in its nature, in that it refuses to be objective. It refuses to be objective because both Stephen and I have been in the fight for Palestinian liberation unabashedly for all of our lives, right? And so coming into this book and saying the only way we can engage with this ethically is to be clear on that up front, that this is not an expose to be like, can we find a way? It's like, no, there are Palestinians living in a settler colonial condition from the river to the sea, and psychoanalysis happens there. And can we go and also trouble for me as a clinician, a psychoanalytic clinician, trouble the fantasy of where psychoanalysis happens and doesn't happen, which is always a stand-in for Eurocentric white supremacist ideas about the universal subject, of course, and where, these people are just doing a version of psychoanalysis, just happens to be Palestinian psychoanalysis. And instead going there and being like, no, there are people who are practicing here and they're indigenous to this land, and they are Palestinians, and they are Palestinians from different places that are disconnected from each other, not of their own doing, but because of a settler colonial condition that has set up checkpoints in their own land. And how do they sort of get around that? And how do they practice? And how do they learn from each other? And how do they educate each other despite these challenges? And so I think more and more as we engage this book, and we're so grateful that folks engage it with us, a new version of like the truth that this is a love letter to Palestine, right? And it's a commitment, and it's on every word in that book, it's us committing to the fight alongside our Palestinian comrades. I also want to say that this is very important for us as Lebanese Arabs. Again, defying those borders, the same borders that sort of cut up Palestine, also extend into Lebanon, as we're seeing, of course, with, the settler colony is, bombing Palestine, and it's also bombing Lebanon, right? And so for us as Lebanese, saying, what is our ethical imperative as Lebanese to refuse that disconnect, to refuse that narrative that we are separated from our Palestinian siblings? And what does that mean when we come into it through a psychological lens? And this is, again, I think this is the sort of the heartbeat of the book. The throwing away of our questions was fantastic because we get there, and it might seem like, yeah, of course you're going to throw away these things when you start to meet humans. But all of us have read and engaged and talked to clinicians who refuse to put down their questions, who refuse to just humble themselves and say, you know what, I'm completely ideologically misattuned right now. And what does it mean for me to come in and be like, let me listen to what's actually happening and engage in what is meant truly from a decolonial feminist methodology of coming in and saying, there is no way for us to do this without folks bringing us into community with them and us struggling alongside them to make sense of this, to create new formations, social formations, both among each other, but also then with us. It creates a new dynamic in which we were invited into and struggle next to each other and debate, right? And here we are, Lebanese and Palestinian in Palestine, debating these things. And like the most moving thing is folks being like, hearing our accents and recognizing we were Lebanese and being like, are you really Lebanese? You're actually here. We thought you had forgotten about us. And like that right there is worth everything. And what does it mean then to work from there? What does it mean to take responsibility for the ways in which the Lebanese have forgotten Palestinian? What does it mean for us to re-inscribe that? And I think that's what sort of brought this text to life.
If I can just make a small addendum. I just want to say, number one, when Stephen Frosch, oops, did I say his name? Asked us to change Ayad's name, we changed it to Fakhr. So you're welcome to say that with an American accent. So you can all say Fakhr in an American accent. Fakhr means pride, so I just wanted to put that in there.
Shout out to Avi for exigent sadism. Let them just choke on it every time.
And I do want to also say that, it just occurred to me. It was also it never occurred to me that Fakhr was someone who went into his psychoanalyst in Jerusalem and fucked with them sadistically. So it was really an appropriate name.
Yeah, it was a completely appropriate name. I mean, it's funny because it fucked with them appropriately in Jerusalem, but also was telling the story of a real history, right? Like being in Jerusalem and telling the analyst, this home is my grandfather's home. Right. Your office is my grandfather's home. Right. And we could read that and be like, Fakhr was like, it wasn't, but it was. Right? If we're thinking about Palestinian history and the violence of settler colonialism, that house is like every other house, is a stolen home, right? But yes.
He fakhared with them. And I also just want to say something like, it's very easy to sort of like, and we have answered questions like this, similar questions like this, and we've sort of said these things before, but also as we were I just also want to like highlight, it wasn't, like our interaction with clinicians on the ground wasn't all unicorns and hugs. Like, and I know it might be a shock to some of you, but I'm not always a shrinking violet and might be opinionated at sometimes. And as someone who's been involved in the struggle for a long time, I'm not an ethnographer, This is just like I'm sitting with this, person across the table from me who's a clinician and talking to me, and I'm just kind of like, that's kind of weird, dude. You know what I mean? Like, I'll tell you, like, I don't know if we should be like collaborating with. I know you're living inside, the state now known as Israel, but like, do you think that's cool? And so, like, actual conversations. It wasn't only people saying, "Oh, we thought we forgot us. This is true," but also I just want there is a dissentiousness, and there is a sort of. And there was an honesty. And sometimes that pissed people off. Most of the time, it didn't. Most of the time, the people who come through in this, most of the people who appear in our book are actually friends now and realize that we didn't come there to extract and leave and never come back. They understood that the relationships that we were building were relationships for the struggle, were relationships for the liberation of Palestine, and were honest relationships, that we weren't going to sit there, and they weren't objects of study. So I just also want to sort of put that in a room that like tension comes from these relationships because they're real. And because they're real content comes from them,
Thank you so much. Yeah, I want to speak to a few things you mentioned. I know we're talking about psychoanalysis under occupation, but talking about like the materiality of our work versus just talking about in abstract reminds me of your piece, Theory as Stone, because Edward Said picking up the stone and throwing it at the Israeli occupation collapsed the idea of Edward Said as, oh, he's just our friendly Palestinian who just writes nice papers and talks about Orientalism and occupation. It's like, no, he is a native. He is indigenous to the land, and him connecting with the stone and is also the practice of what he talks about. So, so I love. I love that Psychoanalysis Under Occupation deals with this materiality instead of just theorizing from the United States about Palestine. Like, you guys were there in Palestine connecting with clinicians. Another thing I want to speak to, Lara, your point, we're going to talk about Bassel al-Araj later, but in his 8 Rules of the Nature of War, he says, finally, every Palestinian, in the broad sense, meaning anyone who sees Palestine as a part of their struggle, regardless of their secondary identities, every Palestinian is on the front lines of the battle for Palestine, so be careful not to fail in your duty. So, we reject the idea of identity reductionism, that only Palestinians, of course we want to center Palestinian voices in our work, but non-Palestinians connect to the struggle for Palestine as well. Lebanon, certainly. I'm Bangladeshi, and there are so many parallels between the Bangladeshi genocide and the Palestinian genocide, and that's what brought me to the work and made me so passionate about Palestinian liberation. So, bringing in your Lebanese identity into the work rather than trying to be that kind of objective ethnographer, like I'm just observing, and the extraction of of interviews and of data from these people. It's like, no, I'm here in the trenches with you, my fellow clinicians and my fellow patients, or rather my patients, and
Fellow patients.
Fellow patients. I didn't want to. This is being recorded, but didn't want to tweet that out. But yes, but I think that's beautiful that your identity informs your work. Yeah.
Did you want to say something? I just want to also thank you so much for that. And all I just want to do is riff upon the Saïd glissant part of that, which is that the worldliness of our being and our practice is important, right? And that's where certain academic thinkers, scholarly thinkers, and psychoanalytic thinkers become disassociated from the material reality in which their theory was born. If your fucking theory wasn't born out of the world, then it's fucking bullshit. That's bullshit. And so I want to just thank you for that very much, because I think what we're trying to do is unwind psychoanalytic theory back into its worldliness. I think that's important.
So I guess we can move on to talking about the cases if there's nothing else to add. So our first case from the book that we're going to discuss is with Amjad, and one of the topics we're going to go through is nafs. If you want to talk a little bit about his story, about the idea of nafs, and then we have some discussion questions related to it as well.
Sure. Okay, so what I'll say is that of all the cases in the book, I think Amjad has a special place. When I speak with folks, when every time I've talked about Amjad's case, there's an affect that's so powerful around this case, and I don't think it's by chance. The case of Amjad was gifted to us by our comrade and clinician Youad Ghanadri Hakim, and she actually, when we were in Palestine, one of the times we were there, it was an International Women's Day, and the Association of Arab Psychologists, and note, they are called the Association of Arab Psychologists because they're not allowed to call themselves Palestinian psychologists within the state now known as Israel, had their yearly event, and it was in commemoration of International Women's Day on March 8th, and they invited us to speak, and part of that was Youad sort of gifting us this case and saying, would you be willing to do an in vivo sort of discussion around this case? Because this is a case that Yoad had told us had changed the way that she worked and thought about clinical work forever. She was just like, Amjad changed my life. And so this case is very special also for all the ways in which we were able to engage and sit with the case and what it meant to present and talk about it in Arabic, in Baq al-Gharbiya, in Palestine, and really engage with folks who are on the ground and like could identify with Amjad and knew exactly what was being said, right? So just a sort of overall synopsis of Amjad. Amjad was in his 30s and somebody who had a house in what is now called the West Bank, but worked in Jerusalem, and so that means that there's a checkpoint that he's going through all the time. This is a centerpiece for all of that. And he came to see Yoad after having gone several times to doctor after doctor after doctor for a lump in his throat, and them not finding anything sort of physical wrong with him, right? And so the doctor ends up saying, you need to actually see a psychologist for this. So he ends up in Yoad's clinic. And so Yoad has captive colonial citizenship, and this is from Nadim Rouhani, and this concept, and so that means that he has she has Israeli citizenship, and so, but she's doing this in Arabic, and then being supervised by an Israeli Jewish supervisor, which is the case a lot of times for folks who are within the borders now known as Israel, that they're Palestinians seeing Palestinian clinicians in Arabic and having to back translate to their supervisors and then again, right? So we can start to already understand the matrix in which this exists. And so Amjad comes to see Yoad, and she tells us of the story of him sort of being an anxious type of patient that talks a lot and doesn't leave room for much, right, in the room. And so she starts to talk about, she's psychoanalytically oriented and trained, and so is her supervisor. So she's talking a lot in her discussion of the case about the countertransference she had. She's feeling really suffocated in the room and associates to asphyxiation and suffocation, and so starts to understand this within the context of the settler colonial condition. Why would I be thinking about that? And all the negotiations that they do in therapy, and she was like, the word negotiations obviously has something very specific in the context of Palestine. You can't think about negotiations without thinking about all the ways in which, both in terms of political negotiations, but also negotiating life constantly, right? And so they see each other weekly for a period of a year and a half. And there are many stages she walks us through, and this ball in his throat really chokes him up, and he doesn't know the basis of where this ball comes from, right? And so they're talking about a lot of things, and she walks us through this beautiful sort of back and forth of her identification with Amjad, understanding the checkpoints that he sort of walks her through, all the ways in which the sort of everyday violence of the settler colonial regime, even though he doesn't name it that immediately, right? He's just talking about having to go between checkpoints, and then ways that his boss, who's Israeli, is asking him to bring olive oil from his home, and you can start to sort of feel the heaviness of all of it. And she says, that's what I start feeling, but I also am alerted, this is Yoad speaking, to the fact that there's a lot being said, but there's something underneath that I can't quite get to. And anybody who's psychoanalytically oriented can be like, okay, that is a attuned clinician. And then she walks us through the conversations with her supervisor, who is also a psychoanalyst, right? So there's no reason why the supervisor in an ideal situation would not also be attuned to this. And what we start to hear is a different story from the psychoanalyst supervisor, the story of, oh, this guy just has anxiety problems and let's put him on medication, and he's just a behavioral being. And it's not that Yoad is against medicine, like as a principle, but she was alerted to the fact that this is not usually the conversation we have. I'm telling you as a clinician about my countertransference, and you are responding with, let's just put him on medication. Medication is going to, help him out. And Yoad sort of starts to feel actually this might stop up the relational process we have. What if he loses his symptoms, which seem to be actually very important here, and then we're not able to get at what's underneath, right? But being a good clinician and a good supervisee comes to Amjad and says, I think we might need medication, and Amjad rejects that. He's like, no, I'm not going on medication. So that part was solved, I will say. Then they continue, and he starts becoming more and more obsessive. And so she tells us this story about he comes in and he'll write down all the pieces that he needs to talk about, and they're very detailed notes, and he'll come in and he'll flood the place. So he went from finding it difficult to piece together sentences to talking a lot. And so she alerts us to the fact about how both silence and talking can act as defenses to something. So she's still alerted to something happening, right? But he's starting to feel less and less anxious. And so when she goes back to supervision, the supervisor's very happy. Oh, he's feeling less anxious. This is wonderful. And Yoad's like, wait a second, there's still a lot I'm feeling here that we're not getting at. Can we pay attention to this? And again, it's a sort of repetition of the supervisor saying, no, there's not more here. This person is just a surface area. Now, we can sort of be alerted here in the room about the ways in which like behavioral therapies are used as a racist stand-in, that somehow people don't have an interiority, right? That they don't have time to think about this, that it's just, if he feels less anxious, fantastic, he's done, right? Mm-hmm. So the more and more they go through this, he starts not feeling the ball in his throat as much. And so Yoad decides to ask him, what's happening with the ball in your throat? And he says, in here, when I'm talking, it's gone. But when I go outside, it comes back. And so I don't know. So it's still very much a symptom that's important. Then we have this beautiful part where Yoad goes back to her supervisor and says, this ball, doesn't show up in the room, but it does. It shows up outside of the room, and the therapist says, well, I think now is the time for termination then. And so all of a sudden, out of the blue, the supervisor says, it's time to terminate. He's better. He's feeling better. Let's terminate. And Yoad is like, this is not the time. We're just starting to get into this tension between the symptom and how he's feeling relationally in the room with me. This might not be the time to do this. And the supervisor doubles down and says, no, you are going to stop seeing this patient. So Yoad again tells us the story of like internalizing the authority of the supervisor, like a good clinician, goes back to her patient and tells him, and for the first time, where before he's sort of very even keel, he blows up and starts screaming at her and saying, you are not the holder of this decision. You do not care about sick people, and if you did, you wouldn't be making this decision right now. And what she relates to us is, rather than being sort of surprised, she's elated that he has narrated his own interior world for her in this way and made himself known and his presence known. And instead says, this is the moment, and he's right. So Yoad's like, he's right? I came in here, and this was an unethical move, and he's calling me out on an unethical move. And so she makes that decision right then and there to say, I'm going to continue seeing him, and I'm not going to bring this back to supervision, right? And so part of, that moment is really important, because Stephen and I, in our discussing in this case, read that as an ethical revolutionary act in which she sees the violence being done and what is asked of her as a clinician under the care of a supervisor, that to be in relationship with her patient, who she's identified with, they're both Palestinian, she knows what's happening, that she has a choice in that moment. And the choice is to align with the well-being of her patient. Right? And to say this person is to identify and say, this person knows better about where his process is at. And for me to be able to do ethical care, I can't internalize, right, the colonizer's sort of perspective that would have me believe that this is just a conversion disorder. Right? That this is just him sort of, feeling somatically what is happening and then ridding it entirely and disconnecting entirely of the social and the political realm. Right? And she's Fanonian at her core. But it took that disruption, it took that refusal from Amjad for her to be like, what am I doing? This is my ethical commitment. My ethical commitment is the well-being of my patient. And so I'm going to continue seeing him. And so from there, the most beautiful thing happens, right? She's sort of talking to him. And he says, sometimes I feel choked up by hate. And she asks him, who do you hate? And he says, I hate myself. Right? And from there, starts to tell the story of him, who he has a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old daughter who's very excited about going to Jerusalem to play with her friend. And he gets up in the morning and she wears her favorite dress and puts flowers in her hair and is singing Nutti Nutti Ya Tabi Nutti Fawq al-Bawabi, right? Bouncy, bouncy, bouncy ball, bounce over the wall. And she's singing it over and over and over and over again. So they get in the car, and he's very excited to take her to see her friend. And they get to the checkpoint, and all of a sudden, it stops up, and there's Israeli occupation forces stopping up the border, and what she called clashes between occupation forces and Palestinians, and there's no movement happening, right? And anybody who knows the sort of situation in Palestine, that moment can turn into hours and hours and hours and even a day, right? 24 hours are not the same 24 hours for a Palestinian as it is for the occupying forces. And so he tries to back up. He's not able to leave. They get stuck there, jam-packed. And after a while, his daughter starts to say she needs to use the bathroom. And she keeps saying, Baba, I need to use the bathroom. I need to go to the bathroom. And she's crying and clearly in pain. And so he's telling her, I don't think there's a bathroom here for us to use. But she's a 10-year-old. She needs to use the bathroom. And so he tries to get out of the car and hail down an occupation soldier who draws his weapons on him and says, get back in your car. Get back in your car. He's like, my daughter needs to use a bathroom. And he's like, get back in your car. Tell your daughter to piss herself in the car. Right? So Amjad gets into the car and tells his daughter, Habibti, just do it here. It's okay. Malish, I'm here with you. And he hugs her and he narrates how he smells urine filling up the car. And as they're later on, as they're driving back, he looks at the occupation wall and the checkpoint and he says, you know, bouncy, bouncy, bouncy ball. We are not you, ball. And he feels the ball stuck in his throat. Right? And that's the most stunning, textural, affective, powerful, violent story of Amjad. I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more, but I'm also feeling affect in the room, so I think it's always a good time to stop and take a moment.
I just want to add one thing. The case is obviously central to the book for so many reasons, but also so you think about it structurally. Like you have the relationship between Amjad and Yuad, and then Yuad and the supervisor. But we also forget that there's a relationship between the supervisor and Amjad, right? And to some degree, Amjad and Yuad are the same position. Yuad is the being hailed as the comprador to mediate the relationship between the two. But we are drawn to the attunement of Yuad because she feels the ball herself. She feels it in her stomach, she says. And we tend to think because colonizers are soulless and heartless that they don't have attunement. And we can say they are misattuned, and she was. But on the other hand, she wasn't. She knew she had to stop that treatment because Amjad held a secret that she didn't want disclosed. This is how white supremacy works. You say you don't know, and that's how innocence works. But you know. you know. And it was Yoad's refusal to be a comprador, an agent of supremacy, and to align that broke that. So I just also want to sort of, to a room full of clinicians, call that out as well. You know, who's your supervisor? The state, your ideological formations around you, your supervisor, your employer, your licensing board, or whatever. So I just want to make that visible.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that story with us. I think Amjad's story really is the crux of what we've been talking about. And to build off of what Stephen was saying, if we want to unwind psychoanalysis and truly approach it from, the earth, right? Not approach it from these ivory towers, approach it from the substance, our people, right? You need to remove yourself from these presuppositions of what Arab men are. And to quote your book, the Orientalism of classical psychoanalysis, to overvalue the role of the father, misrecognize phallocentrism as something particular to Arab and Muslim societies. A decolonial analysis of Arab men should not be devoid of an understanding of patriarchy, because that exists everywhere. And the proverb, men are trash is a proverb for a reason. Sorry. I have to joke, even when things get sad.
Because things get sad.
Yeah, because things get sad, exactly. But we should also shift our focus away from that as like an immutable aspect of their identity, right? Amjad is not just some anxious man. Amjad is a man who has to subject himself to a system that is consistently trying to oppress, silence, and emasculate him, right? Consistently, right? And I mean, we can go on and on about how the Zionist entity does everything it can to emasculate Palestinian men, and does everything it can to shut themselves in this light of uber masculinity, which is maybe a discussion for another time. But yeah, and to me, it's this, again, unwinding psychoanalysis involves finding the intersection between poetry and life. Like truly to really think about how the occupation and what it does is then manifests and into this ball into his throat. And the best way for us to explain what this man's condition is nefs, which is the word, it means to breathe, it means breath. Like it's almost, it's really something so powerful and moving when you really do get to the crux of it. You touch this intersection between poetry and life, where you truly start to understand what the experience of being the colonized subject is. And then when you truly understand it, you can then address it. So I think, for me, this was, just this is personally, like reading your book and reading that story in particular changed something in me fully. And I don't think I'll ever be the same in the way that I practice and approach, for the rest of my life for that. So thank you.
Yeah, I also wanted to add, in this interaction between Yoad and Amjad, we examined the therapeutic dyad, and in what ways is Yoad forced to align with her Israeli supervisor, and then in what ways does she reject that and then eventually align with Amjad, because she is also under the occupation. And that's why she can feel the ball, the same ball that is asphyxiating Amjad. She can feel it as well, because they are both colonial subjects. I wanted to share another quote from the book, where it says, "The settler colonial regime tries to manage, undermine, and destroy interior worlds, as well as social relationships within private and intimate spaces." So not only is the Israeli supervisor shuttering the psychic possibilities for this colonial subject, because the supervisor is just defaulting to these stereotypes about Arab men. Oh, he's just a stoic Arab man who can't talk about his feelings, and I'm so glad he's talking to you now, completely forgetting the fact, the Freudian idea of expressive aphasia. He's talking and talking and nothing's being said, and Jawad says that too. She's like, I don't know how to help him because he's saying so much, but there's no meaning to what he's saying. And this is because the Israeli supervisor does not feel that there is a psychic interiority to this Arab man, to Amjad. But what's so beautiful in materially is that Amjad, in supporting his daughter and saying it's okay, like you can just like urinate in the car, it's fine, I'm here. He is materially rejecting this idea of the stoic, apathetic, unemotional Arab man, because here he is expressing, this is masculinity, this is Palestinian brown masculinity, him saying, caring for his daughter and supporting the family and even driving her to Jerusalem to play with her friend. Like, this is the love and the care that Palestinian Arab brown men have for their families and for their community. And that entire psychic interiority is rejected by the Israeli supervisor saying, well, he's better now, now that he's talking, and also he has conversion disorder, like, bye.
Right.
That's right. That's exactly right. And there's just a couple things here, and I love that you picked that out, and I think, many of us are aware of Nader Shalhoub Kavrkian's work about unchilding, right? And this is a perfect example of that. In that moment, that child becomes, capital in the hands of the state, right? And is the foreclosure of her actually experiencing the textures of childhood. It could become there. At the same time, her student, Abir Othman, talks about unfathering, right? And that is an attempt in both those, it's a simultaneous attempt to unchild and unfather, right? Is not provide the space for the expansiveness of being where there's only, right, a conversion disorder to be experienced, and that maleness, particularly Arab Muslim maleness, is only relegated to behavioral beings and hypermasculinity, and the only way I can express myself is through a symptom rather than right in front. And this is what's important about what Stephen was saying about the sort of white supremacist misattunement, is that it's not like you have to search for this part of Amjad. It's right in front of her eyes. And she could look her entire life at Amjad, and because she's a white supremacist Israeli apartheid settler, she will never see him in his expansiveness. And that's the misattunement. What does it mean for us to tell the truth about that? To say that there's fundamentally a disconnect here, that to be a settler, the indigenous cannot live. And therefore, to be a settler clinician, you cannot see the indigenous, because that is a disruption of your settler colonial logics that are infused into the clinical space as well, right? At the same time she's not seeing him, she's also criminalizing relationality, right? The ending is to not allow Amjad to speak of the world in which he lives, in which she is complicit as a settler, right? She creates that world in which Amjad has to go through those checkpoints in his own land. She is part of that. Just because she's a clinician doesn't mean she's not. To the contrary, she actually gives cover to the state to do these sorts of things by pathologizing Amjad, by having logics of clinics and all these sorts of things that then gives words and pathologies to what Amjad is experiencing rather than understanding it as a condition, as a symptom, a register of the condition in which he's living. So don't let Amjad speak, because if he speaks the truth. That's Fanon. Right? But also, let's criminalize this relationality. I can't let them stay in this room together. What would happen if the clinician and the patient saw themselves in each other? What would happen if we're able to practice an ethical psychoanalysis that didn't rely on you being neutral? Right? What would it mean for Yoad to do as she did and say, I see myself in you because the same checkpoint you go through is the checkpoint I go through, right? And because that's the truth of the condition. What does it mean to tell the truth? To have a militancy in terms of telling the truth of the condition. It's also about criminalizing affect. One of the most beautiful things about this case, Yoad is a militant feminist. And if we read this through a white feminist discourse, the moment where he stands up and yells at her is a moment where she potentially could have crumbled and said, he's enacting violence on me, right? But she sees that as the space of life. This man who has a ball in his throat, in which the condition is that he cannot speak, all of a sudden bursts through life, affect, rage about his condition. And instead of sort of stepping back and being scared, she's elated. She recognizes that. She goes away from femo-imperialism, as Françoise Vergès would tell us. And she's like, no, this is the moment of life right here, right? This affect is what gives him life, and that's what she leans into. And what does it mean also to be able to have that space to do that, right? To not read things through these logics that then become ossified, is to read them through the context in which they come to be alive. And that rage is actually self-sustaining to him and sustains life. And Yoad's like, bring it on. This is it, right? And that's the ethics of it. That's the revolutionary feminist ethic, I think, and why Yoad is truly a hero in this. She's a feminist hero in doing that because she's able to read all these different textures at the same time and refuse the disciplinary techniques of the field, not only just of her supervisor, but also of the field that would say when somebody is affectively over the top in the room, that is their inability to regulate their emotions. She actually reads it the opposite. She's like, that's where life is right there.
Stephen, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm
all good, all good.
I'm taking fucking mental notes right now. That's what I am. I'm not gonna remember that.
Well, thank you so much. So the next two cases we'll be talking about are Muhannad Yunus and Bassel al-Araj. And some of the ideas we want to talk about are willful subjects, parallel processes, sumud, and yeah, I know, yeah, we could be here all day talking about this, but if you want to kind of give a brief summary, I could also give a summary. Yeah.
Do a short summary.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
We would definitely love that. So, Bassel al-Araj was a pharmacist originally in profession. He was known for his activism against the Israeli occupation in the West Bank. He did walking tours of the occupied West Bank, connecting this history of resistance and martyrs, and he would show sites of where these martyrs came from, where they enacted their will to live in resistance. And he was unfortunately arrested and tortured by the Palestinian Authority, the collaborators with the Zionist entity and the Israelis, and after his release, he cut off his family, he insulated himself, completely isolated himself. He has a very, very, I think, probably principal body of text where he wrote kind of his thoughts, his approach, his take on history, life in Palestine. It's in Arabic, it's currently being translated to English, so look forward to that. And on March 6, 2017, the IOF raided his home and assassinated him, but not before Bassel put up an armed fight.
Yeah. And Muhannad Yunus is a short story author from Gaza City who completed suicide on August 29, 2017. And Muhannad looked up to Bassel and his writings and his philosophy. So we want to talk about parallel processes in which the phrase "the personal is political" really comes to light with parallel processes. Muhannad experienced many setbacks in his journey to becoming a short story author. He was prevented from leaving Gaza. His parents wouldn't fund his education. He was prevented from his social development. He wanted to marry someone, and his parents rejected this marriage proposal. So at the same time, we're seeing how the Israeli occupation is closing opportunities for him. He wants to study abroad. He wants to leave Gaza, and he's unable to. So to bring up a quote from the book, the Israeli siege of Gaza and Muhannad's father represent a parallel process, one in which they replicate one another, each identifiable as distinctly suffocating forces. And Muhannad's story symbolizes this suffocating assemblage of settler colonialism and its dialectics with family and internal dynamics. So the shuttering of opportunities and possibilities and futures of the Israeli occupation on Muhannad mirrors what he was experiencing in his family dynamic. And you know, unfortunately, he completed suicide, and Basil was also assassinated. These parallels between the occupation, whether they directly contribute, in the case of Basil with the assassination, or I have like revolutionary suicide up here, Muhannad's reactionary suicide, that the occupation suffocated him. We're talking about nafs as well. He was asphyxiated by the occupation and he took his own life. So what is life-making and death-making under the Israeli occupation? How does the Israeli occupation produce necropower and biopower? And then how do we resist that through sumud and cultivate willfulness in our patients when the institutions, we saw with the Israeli supervisor, we're seeing here now with the occupation in general, how do we cultivate this willfulness in our patients when the institutions seek to rob their autonomy?
Okay. Let's take my notes here for a second. I think. Hi. Thank you, by the way, for breaking that down for us, because it takes a lot. It takes a lot. I want to confess that this was the hardest part to write in the book, I think. I mean, as moving and powerful as Amjad is, it is kind of like the Amjad pushes you forward, pushed us into realms of analysis. And Lara would lay down analysis, I'd go in there and lay another. We each go like, "Yo, you're smart. Oh, you're smart." You know, like you get, but like the more you go into this case, the more it pushes you forward and opens up possibilities. Basil and Muhannad are the opposite. It really took incredible intellectual discipline in many ways to think analytically about them, because issues like suicide and death seem like foreclosed sort of analytic spaces. Like we're not on, like, you know, no one's like, "Yay, suicide, let's make that as an option," right? And to think about it challenges every part of us, and I think part of that is because we, by and large, even racialized subjects in North America, don't live under systems of death like you do in settler colonial oppression in Palestine, right? Where death, we have that in North America, by the way. I'm not saying there's not a proximity to that, especially with racialized communities. But in Gaza, that's a whole fucking other level, right? Apart from the prison that you live in and lack of freedom of movement, et cetera, you know, we all know about the litany of, biannual, mowing the lawns that the Zionist forces would do. And the level of destruction, which now seems so minuscule, but remember, 2,000 people every couple of years, 3,000 people every couple of years, significant, murders, right? So what does it mean to live with death next to you every day as a fixture of your life? What does it mean to live in the occupied West Bank, where every time you get up, maybe like a black person in the United States, every time you potentially pass by a cop, you potentially pass by death. You pass through multiple checkpoints every day. Multiple checkpoints meaning a possibility of death every day. Every day. And we see these Palestinians, they're fucking warriors, these young kids, and I take a bus. I was working in Beit Lahm and taking a bus to Jerusalem. Everyone has to get out who's not an international. And these Palestinians would just fucking look right through these fuckers. They're powerful, but we can look at their heroism, but we also understand what that requires, So in that condition, now think about suicide, right? Suicide where people are trying to kill you, and then the logical sort of knee-jerk response would be like, you just gave in to them. They're trying to kill you, and you just gave in to them. You gave them what they want. But it seemed too facile, and it made us really think about what mastery of life and willfulness looks like. And I think, there's much to be said, and I'm just trying to sort through a genocide that's happening now, right? What does it mean when you live in a deathscape? And what do you do to maintain what liberally could be called autonomy, body autonomy and life autonomy in those conditions here? When you're living under literally serious genocidal erasure, right? And I think the nexus between suicide and resistance is the armed resistance, and the ways in which you understand those commitments that you're making, because you reject the mastery of death. You reject someone else's mastery of your own death. So I think that's just the kind of the initial takeaway. Muhammad is a tragic figure, but we read him as someone who is rejecting the mastery of his own death, rejecting his father's mastery of his life through neglect and really cruelty, and of course this sick, sadistic imposition of death by the Zionist state when they refused to give him a permit to go to university or to accept a prize for his writing, right? This is someone who offered zero, if you think about it, actual danger to the apartheid Zionist state, right? But it was a death sentence. So I think that's what we're pointing to. What are the psychological sort of configurations around when we rewire our relationship to life and death? And a mastery or a willfulness maybe, of taking life to a particular end. So that's the big piece. I just also want to drill down between, I really love this piece because I think it also challenges psychoanalytic theory, because when in the beginning of the sort of discussion, we were talking about what are the preconceived notions you have, and you think everyone who has an anxiety disorder in Palestine is going to go there and find out it's because of the checkpoint. Right? Every mental illness can be, derived from some sort of origin within the occupation. Unfortunately, that's not true. Unfortunately, we found, guess what? Palestine, just like any other developing society, has all the same, or underdeveloped societies, all the same sort of, issues going on. Everyone has shitty parents. Everyone has shitty siblings. This is what happens. So, what happens? But what's interesting is when they become language for each other, for the ways in which shit is expressed. And it's not, so if it's the occupation, it might be the parents. If it's the parents, it might be the occupation. It might be neither. But so it becomes the language and the material through which we look, not thinking of determinative. And that's actually, that sort of realization starts with our focusing on Samah in the beginning of the book, the case study of Samah, which we're happy to discuss. So I think that's just a really important point. I don't want to get away from Muhannad and Basil too much, but did you want to continue?
Yeah. Did you have anything else you want to say?
I always do, but
Okay. Like Stephen said, I kind of just want to underscore the relational piece of engaging in this, and I do want to underscore what Stephen was saying about this being the hardest part of the book, and we had to really sort of with each other struggle through like, why is this, and I'm saying that also both to the clinicians in the room, but also just to all of us who are engaged in this, and that there are certain ways that these rules, these disciplinary rules of social order get lodged inside of us. And so this thing about suicidality becomes a place of like squirminess, but Basil al-Ara sort of putting up the fight, right? Like a several hours fight, at least to those who are sort of dedicated to revolutionary justice and all those sorts of things, that becomes easier somehow to metabolize, right? And so, but I think this is the pushing each other to see, what does it mean, number one, to have Basil and Muhannad in conversation with each other, that the settler colonial condition separates them, where Muhannad never was able to meet Basil or otherwise, but still they are connected to each other, and they understand that the settler condition is one and the same, and their entry points are different in terms of that. But we see Basil is very central to Muhannad's writing and thinking about this. And so that, number one, is what does it mean to refuse the disconnect that the settler colonial condition would have us believe is natural, right? Like this, Muhannad is in Gaza and Basil is in the so-called West Bank, and therefore they're not connected. And what they tell us, both through their writing, through their poetry, through how they think together through the condition, is that there is a way in which Palestinians are connected in defiance of that settler colonial condition. That's actually a really important piece of this, which brings us into this different conditions of death, and in thinking through willful subjectivity, right? Is that, and this is the part for the clinician part in me, is that oftentimes when we discuss issues of suicidality in the clinical world, there's this way in which it's the idea of willful being and the fullness of being. When we're talking about willfulness, we're talking about the fullness of being, which means we have to contend with what it means to have the uttermost sort of extension of that. And all of our conversations around suicidality fundamentally come down to liability. That is where our autonomy, right? All our thinking through autonomy, and I'm not saying that we're telling people, go through with it. That's a sort of That's where people end up. Why are you telling people to go commit suicide? No, but that tells me about something, about how anxious it makes people to talk about this. That's the jump. Like there's a big jump between us saying, can we leave space of expansiveness to talk about the fullness of life, which includes life and death, and not from a paternalistic and prescriptive way that fundamentally then relieves us of the anxiety of what it means when somebody decides to be willful in all parts of their being in their life, whether that's through armed resistance or through suicide, right? Like we have to have an honest conversation about this. And I think this is part of putting them in conversation together, was saying, what does it mean to commit to that expansiveness? What does it mean to say that we reject the victim analysis of Palestinians and all people that are oppressed, that there's only a way to be a savior, there's only a way to come in and sort of read them as sort of responding to external conditions that circumscribe their life. And here we have two people in different directions saying, no, I'm actually taking control, right? I'm taking control of this mastery, and I refuse to be circumscribed by the narrative and the contours that are insisted upon by the settler colonial condition, by the state, by patriarchy, by all these sorts of things, right? Like, that's a tough thing for us to do, and yet it is an ethical imperative for us to do if we are truly committed to seeing people as full beings and not just as sort of automatons in response to their oppressive conditions. That's what it means for people to be willful and not just victims. That's what it means for us to say we reject the trauma industry's idea about how trauma only stops up life rather than also animates something central in somebody to make something anew, right? I want to bring it back to Gaza right now, right? Because that's what part of the condition we're speaking about, and I can't talk about this book without talking about that, is that we are seeing this every single day about how people create life under conditions of death. And now I get very worried about us becoming misattuned to the ways that life is being created even as death is being insisted upon. And I think that's part of this conversation, is what does it mean to be with and in presence of people's life-making efforts, right? So another reading Nadira Shalhoub Kavarkian has is we all have it seared into our mind, the photo of the father, back to unfathering, carrying his children's remains in bags, saying, Ya nas hawdi uladi, right? People, these are my kids, these are my kids. And her reading opened up something for me. She was saying that's a reclaiming of his fatherhood and a refusal of dismemberment and death, saying these are not just dismembered parts of my children, these are my children fully. And in claiming them, I'm also remembering my family and reconstituting life and dignity and ritual of death and life in that statement alone, right? And so I think for me, Muhannad and Basil together do that, and I think it demands a lot of us. And that is the least we can do. When I say so, when Basil reminds us of a wajib, a duty, which even the translation does nothing for the word wajib, right? It is our duty to connect and align with people in their fullness, not just in their death. And that is if they're choosing and their sort of alignment, and how do I sort of make my fullness known, and under what conditions, and us sort of being attentive to all of that, especially as clinicians.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so powerful. I think also when a patient expresses suicidality, that is that moment in which we can, that it's an uncomfortable space, but that is the space in which we can engage our patients. Like, that is the moment. Just like when Amjad had the outburst with Yoad, she saw that as the opportunity to truly witness her patient in their fullness. So suicidality can, while it's very, to take one's life is a monumental, it's a big deal, but how do we proliferate life even in that moment of just on the brink of death, right? Yeah.
And to go off what you were saying in relation to the reclamation of life in its fullness and understanding that life and death need to be faced and really truly appreciated, I think you can even see that there's this understanding from the colonizer as well, how powerful it is. And that's why they continue to maintain these necropolitics and keep bodies in freezers for months and think that they can put us all in mass graves and dismember our bodies, and just because you can't recognize them, then ultimately you've erased their entire life narrative. Obviously, we know that that's not the case, but that is the sign of a desperate oppressor. They are trying in whatever way they can to annihilate, and the more they continue to perpetuate that, the stronger the roots are.
Yeah, in necropolitics, Achille Mbembe discusses liberating losses. So what are the losses that we experience through these massacres, these deaths, this genocide, that still end up liberating us? As Yazan was saying, the resistance is stronger, the Sumud is stronger. You cannot break the Palestinian people, no matter how you try to dismember, disfigure, and humiliate. So, where do we find liberation through these mass losses is also the role of the clinician, to continue to proliferate life against the occupation.
And, we are nearing the end, but if there's anything else you'd like to add before we open it up for questions. Let's open it up, yeah. Please, anyone and everyone, if just questions, comments, remarks, any and all are appreciated. And first and foremost, let's thank Lara and Stephen for being here. Yeah. You want to run the mic to people? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Who's first? Who's going first?
This opportunity will never happen again.
Yeah, that's scary. And this dude, it's almost like a threat.
OLC, thanks guys for being here. This is really awesome. I'm interested in you guys expanding a little bit more on self-hate. I think it's like a very common, it's obviously an intention of the Zionist regime to kind of will that on the Palestinian subject. And we see it in Amjad, we see it in Ghassan Kanafani's diaries when he's in Kuwait. But I'm interested in you talking about it almost as a site of politicization. Because when thinking about Amjad, right, like that was kind of the inflection point in their relationship. Is this realization of, actually I hate myself, and the ways that, how can we take something willed onto us by a Zionist regime and actually turn it on its head? Particularly something as intimate and as personal as our hatred of ourselves.
Should we put one by one?
Yeah, do you want to take a couple?
Just one.
One by
One
one?
more? Okay. This is a great question because I think it opens up a number of different issues. The immediate thought that came to mind is just about how, liberal humanism comes in and invites us and conscripts us to see ourselves. If we're going to see ourselves as human, then we have to sort of become invested in these sorts of things. And then if we invested in this sort of universal humanism and humanity, then we also are going to find ourselves lacking, right? So it's kind of like, there's no real fullness in ourselves if we allow ourselves to be conscripted into a certain sense of what selfhood is, if this makes sense. And I guess part of that is, for example, to put a little more concrete, what happens if I am fully invested or I'm conscripted by these sorts of universal selfhood sort of ways of thinking and ways of seeing ourselves, but then also am really angry, resentful, and want to fucking blow up my oppressor. Then I turn to myself and say, I'm really angry at myself. How could I feel guilty? Or I feel impotent. I feel weak, and I'm weak. أنا مش مافيني يعني أنا شو يعني مافيني أعمل شيء يعني ضد هيدا behemoth, right? I can't do anything against this behemoth imperial power. And you feel, then you're like, so you walk yourself into a sense of hopelessness, right? But it's interesting that you said Kanafani, and I was also trying to think about Basil Harish, is to think about I'm doing some work on Fadain and Manadalin and just thinking about as Marxists, they did invest themselves in certain forms of universal humanism. But on the other hand, part of that is to precisely be militant. If you're not militant, it's a form of surrender, right? I don't know if this is guiding you where you're going, because I'm just thinking about like the ways in which Arab societies and developing societies have to see themselves as always failures, because of course we're always marked against sort of teleological paradigms of what is modernity and who we're supposed to be. So we're always going to find ourselves lacking. But we don't find ourselves lacking when we inhabit a space of militancy, when we inhabit a space of, I don't give a shit about what your teleological end is, but that my teleological end is actually my target point of attack. Because if I attack that, that's my liberation. You know? And I think this is actually, think about Kanafani, what happens to him in the end. He ends up with that very famous interview where he refuses to allow the terms of that discussion to be dictated by that imperialist journalist. It's the refusal, and it's a militant refusal. And it's a refusal that is a positive refusal. The rejectionist camp sounds negative, but the rejectionist camp actually is productive. And it's producing, and this is what revolutionaries thought. We always forget that from Fanon to Kanafani to Midarishu, it's talking about the new human. Because it's the point of that failure is the failure of the liberal modern system that actually is that crux where the brown person is always going to be is always going to be lacking. That's the point in which we have to undermine, and that's the point of our liberation. So I don't know if that's too abstract. I thought, but.
Not at all. I like that. Good for you. The wonderful part, Diane, thank you for that question, because I don't think we've ever sort of said this part out loud, but that place in Amjad where he says, I hate myself, I can't tell you the number of people that have come up to us, Jewish and otherwise, who said they expected him to say, I hate Jewish people, or I hate Israelis. Instead, he says, I hate myself. Right? There's something in that, right? What the expectation is. And that's the moment of like, Yad goes, oh, right? And the hating of the self came from the fact that his whole life was circumscribed by moments of humiliation, both in terms of being a father and of crossing checkpoints, of his, what he called pathetic car, and unable to sort of fulfill his fullness and his sort of ideas about himself. And that's why he hated himself and hated the symptom that reminded him every single day of that, right? It was like, if we're talking psychoanalysis, it was the introject. The ball became the introject that never went away. It was actually lodged inside of him. And so in many ways, I actually read that, and I'm sort of connecting this to Fanon, when Fanon talks about the precondition is liberation. If the precondition is liberation, then we can think about this symptom as a register and the self-hate that comes with it as a militant clarity and a reminder of the condition that makes liberation not be able to happen. And maybe that's what you're saying, is like that self-hate becomes a place of politicization, is maybe in its most simple form, the self-hate is what separates us from the arrogance of the settler, right? That is always self-assured outwardly, but has to do all these mental gymnastics and this sort of over-the-top violence and flags to prove themselves. Those are a series of disavowals that they need so much. And so when one is in the space of self-hate, perhaps that's also the militant clarity of like, I am committed to this humanity, but both mine and the new human that we're building and the new world that we're building. And that has to include us being self-reflective in those spaces and be aware of the contradictions. I do think that that can be a internal space, and then also we're on when we need to be on. And I think that's the difference between the self-indulgence and then the sort of the political commitments of the, of like, this refusal is there. But to think that the refusal doesn't include contradictions of us constantly wrestling with ourselves and wrestling with the ways in which we're bringing the world into being, I think is a naive place, and that's the space of beauty and connection and comradeship, and what Stephen was saying in the beginning of like the tensions. Those are the seams for us to keep pushing forward. Like, don't be afraid of that space.
Two more questions on this side.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much. I've seen you both before in a different talk, and it's always so amazing. There's so much I want to say. First, psychoanalysis broke my heart a long time ago, in that its expansiveness never really encompassed some people, racialized people, marginalized people, etc. And it's always been a little bit of just a pain that I carry with me, and its limitations around understanding death and dying, and that our lives stand beyond the time that we're here and the time before we came. And so, for me, I had to kind of get into other ways of working, including psychedelic work and different kinds of ways of healing and different practices beyond psychoanalysis for me to feel a little more like I could fully be myself. Today, I just was thinking about what was so moving for me and what were the moments during the talk that I was like, and it was those moments where people push through their humanity and they just like refuse to not be a human being that takes care of their daughter, a human being that claims their, and those moments are so incredible and they're so beautiful. So my tears were just like I was flooded with so much, awe and beauty about life and humanity, and that's what that was about. And I think that's what this work is about: is to remind everyone about what we really are supposed to be looking for in our patients, in our friends, in our families, in ourselves. Like those moments where we expand beyond the limitations put on us, when we refuse to just take the status quo or your supervisor's advice, whatever. And it was beautifully done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen and Lara. Amazing as always. So it's a good question. I think after the last question, I have a love-hate relationship with psychoanalysis.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah. And I think just your book is a testament to something that psychoanalysis could offer, that could have, some use, some potential for liberation, for Palestine. I guess my question is about the limits of psychoanalysis, in particular with, say, like the Israeli supervisor, and what was not legible to them in terms of what Amjad was going through. There was something that was just not legible, and you need a group for psychoanalysis. You need to make meaning. You need to all agree on what the ball is, right?
Yes.
So my question is that impasse, right? Well, you said phenomenon. There's an antagonism just by the virtue of her being a settler. There's congenital antagonism that's structural. And then do we understand that? Do we try to understand that? Does psychoanalysis help us understand it? Is that a trap to try to understand it? What is it? So that's kind of what I'm asking.
So I'm not about recuperating psychoanalysis, and that's just like, that's it. I'm writing a book about psychoanalysis for revolutionary futures as one of many tools towards revolution. And I think this is where we end up going, as in any method that becomes purity, right? That becomes a tool of white supremacy, which is the psychoanalysis that breaks our heart, and it should. I'm glad it broke your heart, because that means that you're not willing to compromise and sort of pretzel yourself into the type of subjectivity and the social reproduction that the psychoanalysis that we are, when we talk psychoanalysis capital P, we're talking about an institutionalized psychoanalysis that primarily speaks about whiteness in hiding, right? Like it talks about a universal subject, but who are you imagining when you're talking about this psychoanalysis that disciplines in a particular way and that recreates the subject in a particular way? And anybody that falls outside of that is disciplined very quickly. Trust me, I know. Proudly so, right? So I think there are limitations built into it constitutively, and that's okay. I think when people start, like, if you believe your own theory of psychoanalysis, it's gonna be okay. if it meets its limitations and then recreates itself over and over again. Part of why I love psychoanalysis as a theory is because it holds ideas about contradictions, about fluidity, ideally, right? Fluidity, desire, libidinal energies, like it's a method to read the things that are oddly placed within us and that we don't quite yet know, but the most important thing for that is that it's constantly in emergence. It's never fixed. When you run into a fixed psychoanalysis, which many of us know, it's that fixedness that runs counter to a decolonial or liberatory process. And that fixedness is an insistence that this is psychoanalysis, this is not psychoanalysis, which we hear all the time, right? Oh, I like this idea, but that's politics. Oh, I like this idea, but maybe you're introducing this. Like, that's the moment where all your antennas should go up and be like, that's a purity test, and that means that's white supremacy at play, right? And that's the sort of configurations and the constellations that an institutionalized psychoanalysis comes to be sort of organized around. And why there's a expectation that you excise central parts of yourself before as a precondition to being accepted into psychoanalysis, or let alone being competent enough to recreate that clinically. That's not innocent. That's what he was talking about. That's not innocent. Just like in the settler colony in that is now known as Israel, just like here, the reason why we take to task supervisors is because they're doing the work of social reproduction of the settler colony by expecting that their supervisees do that as well, and then their patients. What an amazing network that's so robust. You go from the state to the supervisor to the clinician to the patient. And that is what creates normativity, right? So I think those are the limitations of it as a method. But if it's a constantly in movement, and that means, by the way, that we are, I'm calling Ruth Wilson Gilmore here, like building the future from the present, that is a process of psychoanalysis, that we are committed to doing that. That there are ways in which the world includes all the things that we're trying to build, the conscious and the unconscious, and the unknown to us, and we don't know them till we step into being. We see this in this movement right now, but those things are constantly in motion. And what does it mean to divest ourselves from a place of fixedness and to know? What a colonial impulse is to like constantly know the contours of everything, right? That's the sort of psychoanalysis that I'm imagining, and I don't, I'm not trying to be like, everything's psychoanalysis. No, it's not. That's the reason why but I am saying that I refuse that somebody has ownership over what a psychoanalysis looks like, right? And if we can constantly call out the limitations when it becomes ossified in that way, I think we're in a better way to use it as a weapon, among other things, towards liberation.
I just want to add something more cerebral, very briefly. I'm sorry, just because Walter Rodney comes to mind about thinking about the same way he would describe Marxism, which is I think it's important for us to realize like fuck psychoanalysis for whatever that shit is, right? Fuck it. Who gives a fuck? It's a series of theories that become relevant only when specific material conditions are relevant to it, right? So the problem with psychoanalysis is that it's seen as this universalist sort of thing, and they put it on every condition, like just like that, right? Just without, awkwardly. Help me out with the language. I'm fucking like aphasic now myself. So, overlay it just without understanding conditions. So it's like that in Japan. It's like, the law of the father, blah, the lack. Fuck Lacanians, by the way. Fuck them. I came in as a Lacanian, great thought, but they're fucking moronic the way they think about the world.
Why don't you explain why rather
Because
than say that?
because the world for them is the material for the theory rather than an opposite. And the only thing we can say about Freud is it does come out of a particular condition. And we want to think about psychoanalysis as a mode of analysis that comes out of the emergence of the hegemony, not the emergence of, but the emergence of the hegemony of capitalist modernity. And the emergence of hegemony of capitalist modernity, where white forms of nationalism are essential to that, right? So everything can be used as a weapon. It depends how it's held, right? So it's to think about, just like Walter Rodney thinks about, like Marxism, he says, is not a universal theory. It's a theory of conditions of capitalism. And those conditions of capitalism are material conditions that are always local, that are also linked to other systemic things, right? So I think psychoanalysis, when we talk, I just want to sort of like tweak our language a little bit. We said like we're not objective, but we are objective. We're not neutral. But we are into material objectivity, historical materialism, material objectivity of conditions on the ground, of what are modes of oppression. Right? And it's in the hands of certain people, whether they're poor white folks or queer folks who are feeling oppressed or whatever in particular conditions, or women in 1920 and shit that freaking Freud's tripping over his own dick to try to figure it out, right? Or today in a world of colonial, where we understand how global white supremacy works, right? So psychoanalysis is nothing but a Kalashnikov in our hands, which is appropriate for certain forms of warfare, certain forms of analysis of material conditions on the ground. And sometimes it's not relevant, right? Don't bring in the law of the father and tell me about patriarchy in the Arab world, because somehow it functions in a different way, right? We love our fathers more, blah, blah, blah. Because that's just fucking racism.
That's actually
right?
been said, by the
That's
way,
actually,
at a
that's like a
conference.
thing, right? So I just kind of want to like bring it back to that, thinking about having not fidelity to psychoanalysis, but and valuing every theoretical analytic that we can use that helps reveal conditions, material conditions on the ground, and how we can analyze them and dismantle them to rebuild something more beautiful.
All right, I want to say first, thank you guys so much. Thank you to my comrades Bushra and Yazan as well for organizing this talk. I had the pleasure of seeing you, Dr. Sheehi, at the People's Conference last weekend. And when I saw that you were speaking this weekend, I was like, I have to be there. But I wanted to ask about kind of what you brought up about the refusal to be a comprador and an agent of white supremacy. Especially for us as clinicians and trainees. I'm a resident physician, and working in a system where I'm a Black woman, I am a colonized subject myself, I'm from a working class background, and so are my patients, but my supervisors in the system I'm working under are bourgeois, white, Zionists. I'm always feeling like I'm existing in a state of rebellion where I'm like aligning myself with the patient in opposition to what my supervisors are telling me. But I also feel that as a trainee, I am beholden to the system for some legitimacy and like knowledge, and I'm also still learning. So I feel like, well, I guess my question is how to kind of like compromise those, or like what compromise can we come to with those two things of like rebelling against the system, but also like taking away the parts of it that are helpful for being doctors or healthcare workers who are like committed to liberation.
Yeah, that's a great question. Mr. Wishy? Okay. First of all, I recognize you. Thank you for coming. Yeah, it was good. We didn't get a chance to talk, so I'm happy you're here. So I just want to kind of name something and just acknowledge it, because I think part of these conditions is that a lot of times things happen and processes unfold and nobody names them for us, and then you end up being the one holding all of that and having to consistently name, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, which is a form of abuse, right? And I've said this in other situations where like abuse expects not to be named. Power expects to work on us and not to be named or acknowledged. And so I don't want us to underestimate the power of actually saying, this is exactly what's happening. Right? And part of, I think, coming, sort of recognizing, contextualizing is locating yourself in the way that you have, not in an empty identity politics way, but in a militant clarity about your positionality in relationship to power and your relationship to modes of oppression and where the crevices of vulnerability are for you, right? That's real. And so I just kind of want to acknowledge, like, that's real and that's why I think you are always tasked, and when I say you as a sort of like, especially folks in training, are always tasked with like figuring out these impossible conditions that you find yourself in. When you are beholden to that supervisor to sign those papers and say that you've passed your competencies, it's not helpful for us to pretend those things don't exist, right? And why actually we need supervisors and faculty to step the fuck up and support you all, right? And this is real. We can't do that. And that's it's the parallel to movement building, right? There are many of us across this settler colony that have built those networks but part of it is making that known and saying, you know what? We want to make sure that people in positions like you are never have to rely on an abusive supervisor for a reference. Never have to rely on somebody to write a letter of recommendation for you. Never have to rely on abusive people to get something published. But that's building an infrastructure, and we're far along in that infrastructure, which is why they're melting the fuck down, right? They're just like, oh shit, there's no more like, gatekeeping here. They're in. They're in these positions. And I say that glibly, but it's actually true. And I think this is part of it, but that's where like the fear of a brown, black, indigenous planet is like so ripe, and why they become even more insistent on the violent ways in the training process in which you are told to not identify with your patients, right? So there's several things happening. Like, I don't think you actually can be alone in solving those problems. We need an infrastructure to do that. I think healthcare workers for Palestine is a part of that. When you have that behind you, we can be much more bold to be like, I'm taking this position because I know there are folks who are going to have my back, right? I can sign this thing because if something happens to me, we have a network of solidarity that can jump into action, and I can do that. And also then there are the everyday indignities that we suffer because we understand just by virtue of having a relationship with the state, we are oppressing people. And we have to be honest about that. And then we have to think through, how do we reconfigure this so that we don't do that over and over and over and over again? The one way that was helpful to me was to start to parse out why things were being told to me the way it was. So this idea, you over-identify with your patient, and what does that mean? That means you're not a competent clinician because you can't be neutral enough, right? To read that as a colonial logic, to criminalize that relationality, why wouldn't you identify with your patient? Like, at what point is that identification actually bad? So we read the symptom. That identification is bad. Why? Because like you add, you'll be able to attune to that patient in ways that then jeopardize that person in power that is able to misattune as a function of their job, not as an accident, right? To keep that sort of system going. So there's sort of just multiple layers always happening. And I think our ability to maintain the militant clarity about all those layers and how it lives inside of us, and when you go home, how utterly heartbreaking it is that we do have those impossibilities because of the way that things are structured, but that in the end, every day you wake up and you have a political commitment to reinventing the world, which includes the ways we do things. Che Guevara is a big person for me in that. Like, how do you despecialize our knowledge? And I'll say one last thing, and then I'll leave it, is that I know everybody who's a trainee in here has heard before, just do it this way now, and then after, when you graduate, you can do it your way. There is a truth to that, folks. So it's not just an ever delayed process. Now, they bank on us forgetting that, right? They bank on us getting out and being eaten up by the system. But there is a truth to being, licensed independently and being like, guess what? It's worth risking my license. It is. And I will. And I'll do it for my students, and I'll do it for you, and I'll do it for everybody who joins the movement, because that's what it's for. Right?
And I want to say much more straightforward. So, this is like a therapy session for me, like people break down defenses, and I'm just at the point where I'm just like, sorry, I'm just going to talk it real now. So forgive me. I just want to say 3 things. Number one, I want to thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for being real to yourself. Thank you for being real to your patients. Because it fucking matters. It fucking matters. And I know, whether it's residency or untenured or whatever, wherever you are in your thing, people go, oh, you can't do that. It's like, it's fucking bullshit, because half the time institutions are freaking goddamn cowards, by the way. And you can just be like your true self, and they'll be like, sorry, come after me now, but they really won't, and they'll give you the talk, whatever. But so keep doing what you're doing, because in so many years, you're going to have people come back to you, and you're going to be like, yo, you changed my life. If it weren't for you, I'd be dead. If it weren't for you, I'd have dropped out. If it weren't for you, blah, blah. So I just want to tell you that and reassure you that, and thank you for that. That's number one. Secondly, I just want to say, as racialized subjects, do what you've been doing all your life, which is like, we learn from them. We're fucking in your world. We know everything about you. We know everything about you. We know how you think. We know how you work. You know what you eat. We know if we bring in, or don't, yeah, but we know if we bring in an ethnic dish, you'll be liking it. So learn from them. Not from them, learn them. And also don't be alone in it. Because you are a warrior, but we get picked off. You're a troublemaker. You're whatever. The shit about like how institutes work, that like they think that you're like, what is it? Like not cooperative as a person or something. So they won't. No, not you. We know you, sister. We know you. We know you. But I'm talking about like when you want to be advanced to like in a training that like people are like identified like not collegial or whatever, and they're gonna and they don't take you on. So that will always happen. Obviously, as racialized subjects, we're always going to be problems. We're always going to be angry. We're always going to have chip on our shoulders. Blah, 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 blah. But when you're with a bunch of other siblings and comrades, you know that, because you don't do it to you. So keep doing what you're doing. Fucking learn them, because that's where the logic that they're coming from, the discourses that they, how they will pivot. Right? As gorillas. We're gorillas. And we need to know which way they'll step. So if you listen to Bassel Araj's like tours that he would get, he would say like how all the guerrillas knew how the occupation army was going to come in, so how they bait them. Just like they're doing, by the way, I don't know if you see this, if you speak Arabic or not, or if you watch, the resistance is kicking the Israeli occupation army's ass. They can only use 2,000-pound bombs because they're going into these places that they've cleaned out, and they're getting their asses handed to them, and we see the videos every day. Why? Because the resistance knows how they act. They know how to bait them, and they know how to get them. So we also are learning the way these oppressive structures think, and we can anticipate them and then just do it collectively.
Would the panel be willing to accommodate 2 more quick questions, I'm told?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's on our space. I feel like I just need to drop a mic after this. We need to. That was powerful, very powerful.
First of all, thank you both, and Yazan and Bushra, for doing this presentation. It's phenomenal. I want to offer a different perspective in that, what are your thoughts on multi-generational trauma? I'm a full-time psych provider in solo practice, and 99% of my clients are the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community who refuse to go elsewhere despite my pleas and gentle nudges to go elsewhere. They still insist on coming back to see me. How do we not automatically define somebody with multi-generational trauma as having a borderline personality disorder? When my first thought with Amjad was, that emotional dysregulation can be attributed to a borderline personality thing, because most people, as we know, under constant chronic trauma, develop these things. They're part of the adverse childhood experience. So in terms of the Palestinians, and by the way, I lived there with my children for several years. I know exactly what an AK-47 feels like against my chest. And my children, unfortunately, all know what tear gas feels like in their mucous membranes. So we've been in the checkpoints for several hours. We identified with everything that you said, and it's just really, I thank you for illustrating all of that as well. Again, going back to my question is, do you see common themes of, say, the Holocaust, which I've studied in depth, and I actually appreciate Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, in ways he defines the humanity's ability to develop resilience, hope versus despair. Do you see parallels or common threads that can translate over to the Palestinian experience from your psychoanalyses? And thank you.
Thank you. I think if we read any form of oppression as a logic, it's easy to find the similarities, right? And I think that's precisely why we reject the idea and we reject the sort of collapse of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Because every single person on the front lines and healthcare workers who are fighting for Palestinian liberation are also fighting against anti-Semitism. And every single person understands that the Holocaust emerged from white supremacy and emerged from Europe, right? And I think if we're able to just say that, there's a way in which the question just is not even a question, it's an evident truth, right? How these things start to get separated and played against each other is the work of settler colonial logics, where then you have a cynical hierarchy of oppression and suffering. And then we're here talking about this rather than talking about a genocide that's unfolding in the name of that history, right? That is the perversion, right? And I think that's part of what we can honor that. We can say yes, and that's why. And that's why our anti-Zionist Jewish comrades can say never again means never again for everybody, right? And that's part of and then also if we're thinking about, again, trauma as generative, what does it mean to then say, I refuse for that trauma to be stuck in me in this particular way, and how do we create a world in which that never again is truly never again,
I'm going to maybe say something slightly controversial, which is, so we know that trauma exists. We know that there is intergenerational trauma. I tend to push back on how they are flagrantly used. And I don't know if I'm say this, but I'm just going to say it because I got no more filter anymore, but maybe even as a defense for something else. And I find, and by the way, the transitional trauma shit has been around this reading has been around for 30 years. I tend to think that, for example, it's not transgenerational trauma that makes a Jew scared to be in a minority in a basically Christian society, because that's fucking material reality too. There is anti-Semitism. It's prevalent. It's we saw that shit in Charlottesville, right? So it's not so a 20-something-year-old or 40-something-year-old and then 60-something-year-old, Jewish American can interpret this as transgenerational trauma. It could be seen as, no, it's really not. It's just your ability to recognize that there's fucking anti-Semitism that's very prevalent, built into this white supremacist country. Like growing up as a Catholic Arab, I knew that it was black folk, Jews, and Catholics on the fucking KKK hit list, right? So I would be careful about overthinking and over-applying transgenerational trauma when as it becomes a deflection. Just like in Palestine, there's no transgenerational trauma. It's not a trauma of 1948. It's 1948, the Nakba, as a condition in which all Palestinians for the past 4 generations have been living. So I think that's a really important, I'm not a clinician, but it seems to me a very important way to distinguish the position from which the patient is speaking and not jumping to, saying they have borderline, personality disorder or something like that, right? That, again, you're not paranoid. You're not paranoid when you're a Jew in Charlottesville, Virginia, and you're scared to walk the streets because you see people with tiki torches. That's not paranoia. That's fucking wisdom. That's just good fucking judgment. Right? So I think, we just have to understand, be careful how that is distributed and how that is applied. And then when also does it become a defense? Right? When there's someone who says, "Oh, I just hate Palestinians because I have transgenerational trauma from the Holocaust," there's a big solipsis going on. They're like, "Yeah, but the Palestinians weren't the ones who fucking made the Holocaust." So there's an ideological, there's a solipsis here that points us to something else. So it demands of the clinician and the person doing the analytic to do a little harder work, to look a little more carefully at what's going on.
Can I just name also just like a process in the room, right? Here we are to talk about Palestine, and then that question can be very well-meaning. And I want to sort of be honest with you that internally, it's not paranoia when I'm like, is there a plant in the room asking me this question because this is on video to walk me into something? I'm not saying that's you, but I'm saying that does happen. That's not paranoia, folks. That's not borderline. That's not anything. We know how this shit happens. We know that people do come in, and because like with listening to Amjad and saying he's going to say he hates Jewish folks, that's what Zionist and fascist plants come into spaces thinking, if I ask this question, this person is going to become all of a sudden show her anti-Semitism. And I want to speak that because I imagine that many people in this room were just like, is this what's happening here? And if it's not what people imagined, it lives inside of us because that's the condition we live in right now. And that's the defense. And I think that's part of it, is what does it mean for us to speak these things out, to refuse to engage in that, to say this isn't even a question for me. It wouldn't have even occurred to me about the borderline stuff because I'm not reading it. I'm not in that register, right? I'm not in the register of the colonial categorical way of thinking about people. I'm in the register that reads a condition and says this is the condition that produces something, and how do we keep coming back to that?
I was told by our hosts that that had to be the last question, but I did thank you to the people.
Thank you, our hosts. Thank you to the People's Forum. Thank you so much. And thank you too.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you all.
We'll talk to you.
So much.